Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so stoked that you're here for episode 31 of the show. Just a heads up for you, I am working to get over a cold, so if I sound like a dying squirrel at all, please forgive me. Looking back really quickly on last week, I really hope you enjoyed Dennis and my conversation. He was so much fun to talk to, and I have to say that he has one of the most pleasant voices for listening. It's always such an awesome change for me to talk with someone on the show, and I really enjoyed the process of reviewing Transistor in tandem with him. For those of you who may have listened to the show for the first time last episode, I want to let you know about a couple of the ways you can contact me with your questions, comments, recommendations, dares, or whatever else is on your mind. You can find me on Instagram at klutchkittengaming, where you are free to shoot me a DM, or you can email me at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com. I generally am pretty quick to respond, and I would love to hear from each one of you. This is where I generally encourage you to jump over to iTunes to give the show a 5-star review, but today I have a different task for you. If you enjoy the show, like if it's become one of those podcasts on your weekly rotation, I would love it if you considered telling a friend about it next time you're getting chicken dinners in Apex Legends or, well, dying in Dead Cells. As nice as reviews are, what really makes the biggest difference is when you recommend the show to your friends. One last thing before I mention a small piece of news for this week, I need to make one correction regarding Farloan sales. If you're exclusively a PS4 or Xbox One player and you wanted to check out Farloan sales after episode 30, you probably noticed that it wasn't showing up on either of those storefronts. My good friend Benya reminded me that Automotive is currently working on the PS4 and Xbox One ports, but the game isn't on those platforms quite yet. For the news this week, most of the stories are really not that interesting or kind of sick to think about. So to keep things light, I want to mention one small story that Imran Khan wrote about that was just so funny to me. Just the other week, Nintendo had their Pokemon Direct where they revealed the 2 new 8th generation Pokemon games, Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield. Now, obviously the internet had a heyday with making memes about the games, and one funny image that popped up in particular was an image of a third title called Pokemon Gun. People thought it would be funny if one of the games was named that, and unfortunately, there's at least one newspaper publication that didn't do their due diligence, and they reported about the quote-unquote new Pokemon game, Pokemon Gun. Obviously, false information on the internet can be harmful at times, but this was one of those instances where someone just took probably the first image that popped up on Google Images and made a dumb yet very funny mistake. Let's transition now to today's game. Today we're going to be talking about a game called Iconoclasts, which is a 2D, Metro-inspired action platformer created by Joachim Sandberg, who also goes by Cognac. I know I probably just butchered all of his names, but Swedish is not my first language, so you'll have to forgive me on that. The development of this game reminds me a bit of Eric Barone of Stardew Valley because it was created by one guy over the course of nearly 10 years. That ends up being both a positive and negative for the game, but we'll get more into that later. Cognac is located in Sweden, and some of the other titles he's worked on include Nuito Love 2 Devolution and Legend of Princess. Iconoclast was released on January 23rd of 2018 for PS4, Vita, and PC, and the Switch port was released on August 2nd of 2018. According to HowLongToBeat.com, Iconoclast takes anywhere from 11 to 15.5 hours to finish, and in terms of controls, you can use either gamepad or keyboard and mouse. I personally used my Xbox 360 controller, which worked great, but I've heard keyboard and mouse are just fine as well. Have you ever felt called to a profession? I mean, a family-given, heart-wrenching feeling that a certain job is right for you? Well, being a mechanic is my calling. Not only am I incredibly good at it, I love how it allows me to help my friends and make my hometown look even better. Now, you might be thinking, why is she telling me this? Good for her that she's wanting to do something. Just go do it and stop blabbering about it. Well, that's where you don't quite understand. You know the one concern? That group of arrogant pricks whose one concern seems to be to screw up my life? Well, their leader and god, Mother as they call her, hasn't granted me a damn mechanics license. The thing is, why am I even telling you this? I'm guessing you already know what I do next. Iconoclasts is aptly named because it follows a group of people who are not willing to conform to the beliefs and institutions created by the one concern. You play primarily as Robin, the illegal mechanic, but as you progress through the story, you're joined by a wide variety of characters who each have their own unique personality and perspective to add. When you first start the game, you're really thrown into the thick of things. You play through Robin's illegal decision to pick up her wrench, but the one concern has been in full swing for a while. They've been leeching precious ivory fuel from all of the colonies, and they seem to be planning something big. As such, someone like yourself, someone who can fix a lot of issues, or can cause a lot of damage in their eyes, is a real threat, and they aren't afraid to dish out penance to your town and those close to you. This game gave me a lot of Hunger Game vibes, with a much brighter and happier twist. The crux of Iconoclasts isn't really clear from the start. Pretty much all you know is that you're disobeying the greater power, and that you're going to have to deal with those consequences. You receive narrative elements primarily through conversations with other characters. Whether you're talking with a pirate, spying on the conversation of a couple other one-concerned soldiers, or having a conversation with your father in a dream, you slowly but surely are building your understanding of the world. Let me actually correct that sentence though, because the narrative beats don't really come slowly. Although the gameplay itself is action-packed, there are consistent story bits and new terms that are pushed your way. As such, it's important that we ask ourselves whether or not that's a good thing. Is the story interesting? And is the pace of narrative good for the game? First off, I found the story to be incredibly interesting. Obviously, we all have different tastes when it comes to plot lines, but from the very beginning, when I realized the game was about the tension between the lower class people and an authoritarian government masking itself as a religion, I was sold. That type of plot is so interesting to me, and it was also incredibly compelling in terms of making me want to pull back the curtain on that government. Why do they mask themselves as a religion? Who is Mother, and is she really in charge? What's the larger purpose of suffocating the lower class? These are all questions I had within the first 30 minutes of playing, and I loved it. To answer the second part of our question though, the pacing of the narrative was overwhelming. I haven't made it through the entire game yet, but even partway through, I started feeling swamped by the amount of narrative threads I needed to keep track of. On top of that, a large portion of the dialogue was complex. In a majority of games, you can just press A through a conversation and have a pretty good grasp on what's going on. In Iconoclasts, there were often conversations where I needed to do a double take to understand what the text was even saying. I think this problem illustrates one of the possible pitfalls of developing a game alone, especially over such a long period of time. Although the core plot is fascinating, it feels like Joachim may have gotten himself into the weeds along the way. I'm sure as a developer it's easy to get lost in the details when you're not bouncing ideas off someone else, at least on a daily basis, and that seems to have caused some convolution in the flow of the narrative. All that being said, the narrative is still super intriguing and does add a lot to the feel of the game, even if you aren't tracking every plot and subplot. Now before you start imagining Iconoclasts as being primarily a dark story, I want to clarify that this world is bright and humorous. Yes, the actual story content is heavy, but the presentation helps to alleviate that burden. That's where the narrative veers off for me from the likes of the Hunger Games or Equilibrium. Iconoclast presents the one concern in a lot of ways as a pretty dumb enemy. They are so cocky that they underestimate your willpower to not conform and your ability to fight. Many of the conversations you witness between one concerned soldiers are hilariously ignorant even to their own cause. And that's where the game brings in a lot of its humor. Not only are the one concerned soldiers laughingly stupid, but the leaders each have their own unique personality which fleshes out what your enemy is actually like. Despite many of the One Concern characters being portrayed as hyperbolic assholes, Iconoclasts isn't afraid to tackle more real issues like family conflict and loss. Although I could go on and on about the narrative, what's really important to take away is that although it's not perfectly presented, the depth of the story in this game was a pleasant surprise. One unique aspect of Iconoclast that you may have picked up on is that Robin is a mechanic. I mean, mechanics are great, but usually games revolve around knights in shining armor and space marines. Playing as a mechanic might not sound all that fun, but Robin's tools and personality make for an incredibly fun experience. Before we get straight into her abilities, let's talk about the main flow of the game. As this is a Metroid-inspired platformer, you're not going to have a completely linear path to the end game like Celeste. You're going from location to location, platforming and solving puzzles on your way to a boss, and then generally unlocking some new mechanic which allows you to find the next path to take. There is some backtracking, but it really didn't ever feel too tedious to me because your new abilities often allowed you to reach places you weren't able to get to before. This leads nicely into what you can actually do as Robin. Aptly, one of your primary tools is a wrench. This thing does everything. It damages enemies, it creates electricity, it parries attacks, and well, it turns bolts. Your other main tool is a stun gun, which you can switch between normal shots and grenades. On top of your tools, you also are incredibly mobile and have a block-breaking butt slam. Although you don't have a ton of tools at your disposal, it's also important to mention the tweak system. This works just like how it sounds. You're able to collect certain materials to equip tweaks, which do small things like allow you to spin your wrench longer, breathe underwater longer, or block the first hit you take. None of the tweaks are game-breaking, but they do help shore up some weaknesses you might have as a player. If you're coming off of Dead Cells where there's a ton of weapon variety and upgrades, it might sound like Robin has a pretty limited toolbox, but I think Cognac did a great job of creating some very unique interactions with just a few abilities. Those interactions came in the form of puzzles, combat, and platforming. The puzzles in Iconoclasts are a pretty big portion of the game. Puzzles started off pretty simple, but quickly expanded into more complex systems which often used all your abilities to solve. Especially once I got to a location called the Tower, it felt like every room I walked into had a series of platforms or elevators that I needed to trigger in order to move on. The good news is that if you suck at puzzles, most of them weren't too cerebral or vague. There's one instance that comes to mind where I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to move on, but other than that one time, the puzzles were more about performing certain actions in a particular order, as opposed to giving you an abstract riddle to figure out. This topic actually flows nicely into combat because much of the combat is puzzle-like as well, particularly the bosses. For basic enemies, it felt like no one was the same. They each had a specific weakness or counter, and if you didn't take care of them in that certain way, they were a real pain in the ass. For example, there's a tree-like character that throws a projectile at you, and literally the only way you can kill this enemy, at least that I'm aware of, is to spin your wrench to parry that projectile. That need to learn each specific creature lent really well to each puzzle. It gave them more depth and kept the game from being repetitive. Similarly, the bosses really were just ramped up versions of the basic enemies in a sense, because it was all about learning their patterns. The bosses I faced were all fun and unique and challenging in their own right, but I will mention that this is one topic of contention in the game. There are a lot of bosses, and some people have criticized the unfair difficulty of a few. There was one boss in particular that I found confusing and clunky to fight, especially since I had to keep swapping between two characters during the entirety of the battle, but most of my experiences were pretty positive in the way of bosses. Last but certainly not least, let's talk about platforming. If you're like me and not that great at hardcore platformers, you'll be happy to know that Iconoclast was a breath of fresh air. It wasn't easy by any means, but at no point did the platforming in particular feel punishing. There were times where it was a bit clunky, but I never felt like I needed to make frame-perfect jumps in order to move on. It was challenging enough to be satisfying, but easy enough to not be frustrating. Certain areas required pretty quick timing, but again, it never felt punishingly hard. To wrap up the gameplay section, I think it's important to note the ingenuity Joachim showed in creating this game. Although the narrative felt convoluted at points, The gameplay was simplified in such a way where it was interesting, yet not overwhelming every step of the way. Now that we've discussed the narrative and gameplay, let's take a moment to discuss the art and sound design. When I was doing some research on Joachim, I noticed that his greatest passion was drawing. That passion really showed through in Iconoclasts because this is a gorgeous game. It's bright and colorful, it's detailed, and each new location just makes you want to explore more. The 16-bit art is such a big part of what makes this game great. In addition, the animations were amazing. Each character had a different idle animation which helped give the game so much life and personality. The only thing that was a bit funky to me was Robin's swimming animation, but even so, it was still endearing. As we mentioned earlier, the plot really is heavy at some points, so the art being light and bright really helped lighten the mood. In the same way, the sound design was on point. The soundtrack isn't my absolute favorite, but I can't deny that Joachim did a great job with it. The main theme is cheerful and it motivates you to move forward and think about your mission, fighting back against the one concern. It sets a good pace to the game and again lightens the mood around some of those darker themes that pop up. On the effects side, one of the most satisfying sounds for me was cranking my wrench to open a door. The effects were crisp and flowed well with the game. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, it was exciting to have a deep and complex plotline in an action platformer. The conversations between characters were often funny, but Joachim wasn't afraid to touch on deeper issues as well. Second, the moment-to-moment gameplay was fun. I'm really happy that the systems weren't overly complex because it allowed the creative level design to shine through. Third, the art and sound design in tandem did a great job of masking some of the more annoying things about the game. The game was so beautiful to look at, and the way the sound kept the pace was key to not feeling bogged down. First off, on the negative side, although having a deep plotline was definitely a positive, there's a point where things can get too complex for their own good. If you are a fan of the TV show Lost, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Some of the plot lines and even conversations between characters just became burdensome to work through. Second, although the puzzle and boss design was overall good, there were some design choices which caused a bit of confusion and frustration. It wasn't always clear where I needed to go next, and a few of the puzzles felt complex just because there were no good visual clues in the game. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I tell you whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay this game. You don't have to look far to see some questionable design choices that stemmed from the game being a solo project, but you also don't have to look far to see the passion put into this game. This isn't your run-of-the-mill Metroid-style knockoff. Iconoclasts is unique, and I have no doubt that you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of this game. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in, especially with my sick voice behind the mic. This game was a lot of fun to play for the show. If you end up playing it yourself, I would love it if you shot me an email or DM me on Instagram to let me know your thoughts. Like I said earlier on, if you enjoy the show and if it's something you listen to regularly, I would love it if you head on over to iTunes to give the show a 5-star review. That really does go a ways towards helping the show be more visible to others. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in-game.